All right, good evening.
All right.
You can be opening up to Acts chapter 12. I'm going to tell you a short story that I wasn't going to share, but you would catch me and wonder what was going on, so I'll save you a lot of trouble wondering. Monday at my office, I was coming back from lunch, and I was on my motorcycle, and I back into my parking space because it's easier to get out. So I come in and I make a sharp right turn at a very low speed, and you turn the handlebars on a motorcycle if you're at real low speed, and they're not stable that way. And when I went to back into the parking space, I was at a full stop, but my foot slipped on some leaves, and I lost my support, and an 850-pound motorcycle goes down real fast when your foot slips, and the parking lot does not make a good catcher. Anyway, my elbow hit my rib cage, and I've got a couple of fractures in two different ribs. So if I make funny faces tonight, I'm not mad at you. I didn't have a fight with Betsy. She's sweet as always. And if I don't hug you, it's not that I don't love you. It's just that it hurts. So, now you know my sad story and why I'm acting the way I'm acting. So let's get into Acts 12. Trouble and Judgment is our title tonight, and we have some of both in this chapter. In many ways, this chapter is kind of the end of the first part of the book of Acts. What I mean by that is in the early chapters of Acts, we'll talk about what that means. It's kind of the end of the first part. Then we get introduced to Herod, who is a persecutor of the church. We'll take a look at one of the sons of Zebedee tonight. Peter gets to go to prison again. He seems to wind up there a lot. Not as much as Paul did, but Peter got there frequently as well. And at the end of the chapter, Herod finds out that he isn't God, and then we kind of set up for the next part of the book. So what do I mean by the end of the first part? Well, in the early part of Acts, the geography of what's going on in the church is a lot more concentrated. It starts out almost exclusively in Jerusalem and Judea, and then it spreads a little bit to Samaria and some of the other parts of Israel, but it's relatively concentrated in the early part of the book. We have the story of the eunuch who went on to Africa, but he was an outlier, but it's starting to spread out. In the second part, it's much more far-flung. The leading characters in the first part of the book are the apostles, and particularly Peter and John and James are prominent. Those are the people you hear about almost exclusively in the first 12 chapters. That's going to change very suddenly when we get to chapter 13. In the last half of the book of Acts, Paul is much more prominent. So the primary audience in the early days of the church is the Jewish population. They're almost exclusively reaching out to the Jews. Just before this chapter, we see the gospel open up to the Gentiles, but that's a new thing. So the audience is starting to change. And then at the end of this chapter 12 in verse 25, it talks about how Paul and Barnabas are moving back into focus, and they're really going to kick things off. So that sets up the beginning of really kind of the second half of the book of Acts. So that's where we are. The book's not over. We still have several weeks to go, but it's kind of like a scene change almost in the book as we go through from here. So let's talk about Herod the persecutor. Chapter 12, verse 1. It says, "It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them." So, that's what he did. Now, we read Herod, and sometimes I think we get confused. So we're going to go over some stuff that I hope will be helpful to you as you try to sort things out in the Bible, because there are Herod is kind of like the name Caesar. Caesar was not a person. Caesar was an office, and Herod was a king. So there's a whole Herodian line of kings. They used like a name, but it was, that was a role that they played. So the first Herod that we see, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, is Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the Herod you read about in Jesus' childhood when he was born. Herod the Great is the one that the Magi visited. He's the one that tried to kill Jesus. Jesus and his family went to Egypt to get away from him. But that's Herod the Great. He was a Roman client king. He was not favorable to the Jews. They hated him. Although ironically, Herod the Great is the one who vastly expanded the Second Temple. Most of the places that the church met and that Jesus preached in were built by Herod the Great. But it's not because he had a great love for the Jews or for God. It was because he had a love for architecture and he wanted to build something fancy. So he expanded the temple, but he was not a great guy, and he was hard on everybody, including his family. Then there is Herod Antipas, who's also referred to as Herod the Tetrarch. You might have read that and said, well, what in the world does that mean, Herod the Tetrarch? It sounds like a dinosaur. No, it means it's a quarter. When Herod the Great died, his kingdom was divided into 4 pieces. It was given to his 3 sons and his daughter. They divided it up. And so Herod the Tetrarch means king of the quarter. And so that was Herod Antipas. That's the Herod we read about during Jesus' ministry. He's the one that they sent Jesus to during the trial. He's the one that beheaded John the Baptist. Again, not a great guy, but he's a different guy than Herod the Great. Less powerful, but that's who he was. The Herod we're going to interact with tonight is Herod Agrippa I. It's interesting to me that if you're Herod Agrippa and you're the first one, you still put the Roman numeral after your name. But there it is. Herod Agrippa I, or just Herod Agrippa. You don't want to cough with broken ribs. So that's who we're going to interact with tonight. He is a very interesting and important character, and I'll explain that a little bit more as we go along. But the Jews actually liked him. He was half Jewish. His grandmother was a Maccabean princess, and Herod the Great wiped out all of them, just about all of them, but somehow he survived, and he really loved the Jews and was trying to get the Jews to be an independent country. So he was beloved by the Jews for that. But that's the guy we're going to interact with tonight. And so let's have a little moment just for the history nerds, because this is helpful as we understand things. So here's some dates, and I think we lose sight of this. Some dates and some things that are important. So 722 is when the northern kingdom went into exile. So, we're now at about 50 years AD, or 45 years AD, and that's 722 BC. So, we're talking 800 years almost since the northern kingdom went into exile in Assyria. 587 is when the southern kingdom went in, BC is when the southern kingdom went into exile in Babylon. So, they had heard about the nation of Israel and David and the greatness of God's kingdom all their lives, but it's been hundreds of years since that has been experienced. I mean, we're talking about imagine if you had heard about how great the United States was, but it hadn't been in that form since before Christopher Columbus. It's that old. And so they had heard about this, but it had not existed in many generations. In the early period in between the Old and New Testament, there was something called the Maccabean Revolt. You may have noticed that there's a lot of characters in the New Testament named Judas. The reason why is because the leader of this revolt was Judas Maccabeus. And so he was a hero for them, but he was fighting not against the Romans, but against the Greeks. The Greeks had taken over Israel, and they had forbidden proper Jewish worship. They had perverted the temple. They had put in all sorts of unsavory pagan worship and all kinds of things. I mean, they were not nice at all to the Jews, and they were vile and they were godless. Or they had lots of gods, but they did not respect the real God. And so the Maccabean revolt is when the Jews rose up against these guys and fought them. And for a short time, they actually became an independent nation of sorts. And they did that by forming an alliance with Rome. And then a lot of things happened, and they eventually got the Greeks out of there. And for a brief time, they were an independent nation. They weren't a great nation, but they were independent. But then Rome decided, hey, we're going to put Herod in there, and they lost that very quickly. So they had generations of pain. And so when we read about how they expected an earthly king, all of that factors into why they thought that way. Okay, so, they had all of this going on, and so Herod Agrippa was kind of a last flicker of independence. He's trying to get they were a Roman province during the time that Jesus was there. One of the things you may have noticed was whenever they wanted to kill Jesus, they had to get the Romans' permission to do it. And so, they even said to Pilate, we're not allowed to execute anybody. By the time Stephen comes along, they had the ability to do their own executions, and they took advantage of it. They're becoming more independent. They thought that was good. It wasn't good for the church. But so Herod is trying to curry favor with the Jews in two different ways. He's trying to get them to be an independent nation again, and he's trying to stamp out Christianity. And that wins him points twice with the Jews who were not Christians, because they didn't like the Christians, and so they were persecuting them, and he's trying to wipe them out. For a very brief time, he was installed again as a client king, and they had some measure of independence, but it didn't last very long, and then they became a Roman province again, and a short time later, they were completely destroyed, and Jerusalem was annihilated. So that's your history lesson. Okay, let's move on. Verse 2. So Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. That's a short, simple sentence, but that is a crushing sentence. Who are we talking about here? We're talking about James, the son of Zebedee. You read in the Gospels frequently about Peter, James, and John. Jesus was certainly close to all of the apostles, but those three guys were special. I mean, there were many things. There were many things that they got to be a part of with Jesus that none of the other apostles got to be a part of. He would call them out from the group and say, "Hey, you three, come with me." So we're talking about a very, very special guy. We're talking about the loss of an incredibly rare witness. I mean, James saw things, some of the most impressive miracles were only seen by Peter, James, and John. James was an eyewitness of the transfiguration. Those three guys were the only ones that actually saw it. How many times do you suppose he told that story at church? I mean, some young guy comes up, like Hilton, all excited, and says, "James, I know you've told the story before, but can you tell me about the transfiguration? I think that is so cool." And James would probably say, "Okay, this is what happened." And he would tell you the story. There's only three guys you can ask about that. And James is one of them. There were lots of things like that. So they lost a very rare firsthand witness. It had to have incredible impact on the church. The church viewed those three guys as very special. And so it had to be a shock to the church when one of those special guys was lost. Imagine how it affected the 12 apostles. I mean, as much as the church was aware that those guys were special, the rest of the apostles, other than the three, they had to look at those guys in a very special light. And so it had to be a shock to them when one of the three was gone. Imagine how Peter felt. I mean, Peter was one of the guys. And, so for it's different. You think he was already in an elite group as an apostle, but, you're part of the three. Maybe you feel kind of untouchable. And then one day, one of the three guys gets touched. All of a sudden, you don't feel so untouchable anymore. You remember the first time that some of you haven't gotten to this yet, thankfully, but it's a different experience when all of a sudden one of the people that you grew up with that's your age dies of some disease, and it's like, oh, that could happen to me. So Peter probably had that feeling. It could happen to me, and imagine how John felt. I mean, Peter had been James's business partner and an apostle and a part of this elite group that Jesus spent time with, but John is his brother. I mean, a brother's special. And so they'd been together their whole life. And all of a sudden, James is gone. That had to hurt. And so this is really a tough thing that the church is going through. He has James put to death with the sword. It's a very simple sentence, but it has a lot of impact. I imagine this question came up a lot. Honestly, it comes up for me sometimes when I read it. Why did God let this happen? You're gonna find yourself asking that question about your own life several times as you go on. You may not always get an answer, but it's, God lets things happen for a reason. I don't always understand what it is, and we don't really understand the reason for this, but God did let it happen. So let's move on. So Peter is also in prison. Let's pick up and read here in verse 3. So James has been put to death. Speaking of Herod, it says, when he saw that this met with approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out what he had in mind, given what he did with James. But he's not going to do it during the Passover out of respect for the holy day, which is an ironic thing to say, but that's what they did. So he arrests Peter as well. I loved it in verse 4 where it says he was guarded by 4 squads of 4 guards. So I don't know what they thought Peter was going to do, but he evidently was on a high security detail. He was a dangerous man. And so they had some serious guards there. And so let's pick up in verse 5. We're back in another one of those situations where the church says all we can do is pray. In verse 5 it says, so Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. So let's see what happens next. 6 through 11 is a hilarious verse. It's very inspiring. It says, the night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains. And sentries stood guard at the entrance. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. Get up, he said, and the chains fell off his wrist. I always love that part. He doesn't say that the angel jostled Peter to wake him up. It said he thumped him in the side. He struck him in the side. Maybe Peter was a heavy sleeper. But he hits Peter on the side and says, get up. And Peter's probably thinking, well, how am I supposed to get up? I'm chained to these guys. And the chains just fall off his wrist. Pretty amazing stuff. Pretty amazing stuff. Then the angel said to him, put on your clothes and sandals. And Peter did so. Wrap your cloak around you and follow me, the angel told him. Peter followed him out of the prison. but he had no idea that what the angel was doing was really happening. Hey, in fairness, he had a history of visions, so, he could have been given some slack for that. He thought he was seeing a vision. They passed the first and second guards and came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them by itself, and they went through it. When they had walked the length of one street, suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were hoping would happen." When this dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. So Peter gets out of jail. This is an amazing story. It's so amazing, Peter didn't even think it was real. I mean, he thought he was just having a vision. And they walk down one street, and then the angel's gone. And there he is, on the street corner. And he says, I'm out of jail. I don't know how that worked, but I'm glad. God saved me. Let's move on to our prayer devo that's going on at Mary, the mother of John Mark's house. This is quite an entertaining story. An entertaining prayer devo, I think I called it. Verse 12. When it dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Peter knocked on the outer entrance, and a servant named Rhoda came to answer the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed she ran back without opening it and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." Now, imagine you're Peter in that circumstance. You've been knocking on the door, you call out, and she knows it's you. She recognizes your voice, but she runs off and leaves you outside. There's four groups of guards back there. They're going to start looking for you sooner or later, and there you are stuck on the porch. He kind of wanted to get in, but somebody sent me a funny text about her maybe not having a great attention span here. She was shocked. We'll give her a little slack. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed she ran back without opening it and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." "You're out of your mind," they told her. When she kept insisting it was so, they said, "It must be his angel." Now let me ask you, what was this group of incredibly spiritual people doing? And what were they praying about? That Peter would be saved and released. Okay, do you think they had faith? I mean, I think they're pretty amazing people, with what was going on in the church. And so they get exactly what they're praying for. The girl comes and says, "Peter's here." And their response is, "You're crazy." They don't believe her. And finally, when they figure out, well, she's obviously serious and something's going on, they say, well, it must be his angel. I don't know where they came up with that. Look, this is a kind of a funny story. But what I'm telling you is, you may not be as unspiritual as you think, okay? I mean, sometimes we lack faith in our own prayers. You ever have that experience? And when it actually happens, you're real surprised. You say, wow, imagine that. I prayed for that and it happened. I never thought that would work out. Well, you need more faith. They have the same problem. It may be okay. You got to get over it, but, they have the same issue. It says, but Peter kept on knocking. Those angels can be very persistent. He kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of prison. He said, tell James, not the son of Zebedee, James the brother of Jesus. Tell James and the other brothers and sisters about this, he said. And then he left for another place. He gets out of town, which was the wise thing to do because they're going to come looking for him. This didn't go so well for the groups of four that were guarding Peter. In verse 18, it says, "In the morning there was no small commotion among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. After Herod had a thorough search made for him and did not find him, he cross-examined the guards and ordered that they be executed." So the guards are the ones that ended up being executed instead of Peter. He went somewhere else. This is an amazing story that should build our faith as we look at it. Okay, last bit. Herod finds out he isn't God. He goes to Caesarea in verse 19. Now, who else was at Caesarea that we've talked about lately? I'll give you a clue. He was converted, and he was the first Gentile that became converted without being a Jew first. Cornelius. He was in Caesarea. Now, if you're a centurion in Caesarea and the king comes to town, you can count on the fact that you're going to interact with him, because his job was to give him cover. And so, I just think that's an interesting side note. It doesn't have any significance, and there's nothing mentioned in here. But he's in Cornelius' city, and it's not that long after Cornelius became a disciple. So I thought that was interesting. So he goes to Caesarea. They were having issues with two towns in this area, Tyre and Sidon. And so, this has been going on for a while. We don't know all the details. I honestly didn't care enough to look up all the history on it. But they had some kind of conflict going on. But the people from those cities asked for an audience with him in verse 20. It says he had been quarreling with the people of Tyre and Sidon. They now joined together and sought an audience with him. After securing the support of Blastus, a trusted personal servant of the king, they asked for peace because they depended on the king's country for their food supply. So Herod's consolidating his power here. He's pulling in the northern part of the old kingdom of David and Solomon here, and he's consolidating his power base, and he brings them under the umbrella, and things are going well, or it seems to be that way for him. So he does what most politicians do, whenever they're doing this kind of stuff. He gets dressed up and he makes a speech. So it says in verse 21, "On the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robes, sat on the throne and delivered a public address to the people." You can read about this occasion in the Jewish historian Josephus. He talks about this. Josephus describes the clothes that he's wearing as almost like a mirror, some shiny metal thing that he was wearing that was evidently very impressive visually. But he makes this speech. It must have been a pretty spiffy speech because the response of the audience is, they shouted, "This is the voice of a God, not a man." Again, the Jews and the people that he's got under his rule like him a lot. In some ways, he's a king that they were looking for when Jesus came along. He's bringing the old kingdom back. He's getting them free from Rome. They're at this point probably no longer a province of Rome. They're a semi-autonomous kingdom. Now, he was a client king like his grandfather was, but he was favorable to the Jews. And so they were very enamored of him. And plus, he was trying to root out the Christians and get rid of them, which made him very popular with them. And so they're really pouring it on thick. They say, "This is not the voice of a man, this is the voice of a God." And he doesn't dispute that because he doesn't give glory to God. It says, let's read on. It says, "Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died." Okay. Now, I want you to marinate on that picture a little bit. Okay? Trust me, you don't want to read the history on this. Not pleasant. There's a couple of things I want you to notice. One, it doesn't say he was immediately eaten by worms. It says he was immediately struck down. I had a vision when I was younger, when I first read this, that some colony of carnivorous worms rose up out of the dirt on the spot and just ate him right in front of everybody. That would be a great visual for Halloween. Maybe somebody can work that into their trunk or treat. No, maybe not. That might scare the kids. But that's a very Halloween kind of picture there. The worms got him right in front of everybody. But it doesn't actually say that. It says he was immediately struck down. If you read the history of this event that Josephus told, in the middle of the speech, he collapsed at this point and had to be whisked away because he collapsed. And he died a few days later. As far as the worms are concerned, depending on what history you read, he was either poisoned and developed gangrene, and you're dealing with maggots, or some other disease was gangrene and he was teeming with maggots. Some people think he had an intestinal parasites that overtook him, and he was completely eaten up with worms. None of the things they think it was pleasant. There are some people that dispute this ever happened. Some people just think he was poisoned, historically speaking. But that's what the Bible says. He was struck down immediately, and he was eaten by worms. So I'm going to believe what it says in Acts. And I don't know how that went, but I know that I don't want to have that experience in my life. So that's what it says in verse 23. The interesting thing about this is he intended to stop the church, but he did not. Look at verse 24. But the word of God continued to spread and flourish. He had the power of Rome behind him. He was the king. He had the support of the nation. He was all that in a bag of chips. And you turn around and he's eaten by worms and the church goes on. Sometimes we think we're in trouble when we're really not. Sometimes we think we're in trouble and then God says, okay, watch this. And I'm not saying anybody's going to get eaten by worms, but I'm saying that things end up better than we expect them to frequently. We think, everything's coming to an end. We're in real trouble. I don't know what's going to happen. Are we going to survive? God works it out. And he did in this circumstance as well. Shortly after this incident, Rome reasserts provincial control. We know that from history. And really just a few years after this incident happens, Israel is wiped out as a nation and Jerusalem is utterly destroyed in AD 70. So this is a pivotal chapter. Lots of things we can take lessons from here. And I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. Have a great night. You're dismissed.